Today we are going to be talking about what it's like to heal from disorganized attachment. And I say we because I'm going to be joined today by a colleague of mine, Matt Landsiedel, who's done a lot of lives and podcasts with me before. And he's going to be sharing his experiences of what recovery from disorganized attachment is like and the realities of it, because whilst every person with their distinctive attachment style goes through very unique journeys in healing to become an earned secure attacher, it is one of those things which can be very difficult depending on one's history, attachment style, and a variety of circumstances. So I'm going to bring Matt on now. You're
Good to see you.
Well, likewise, I feel like you and I have done quite a few live/podcast things this year, so it's been a recurring thing.
It has, yeah. Yeah. We both love talking about attachment, so I'm honored to be here. And I think you've been on my platforms this whole time, and this is my first time on your platform. So it's great to meet your audience. Hello, everybody.
Finally, I'm getting some reciprocation after all my effort being on yours. But yeah, I was going to say, just to start off with, would you like to introduce yourself to my audience?
Yeah. So I'm Matt Landsiedel. I am a counselor and facilitator. I do a very similar work to Ken, and I have a specialization in working with attachment trauma, and shame. So I do a lot of work with gay men, highly sensitive people, and empaths, a lot of people that have minority type stressors and these sorts of things. So shame and developmental attachment trauma tend to be very common amongst our population. So, yeah.
Completely agree.
Mm-hmm.
And across a lot of our recent conversations, we've talked a lot about how attachment shows up, particularly in gay men. And today, I thought it would be good to bring you on board because I've had a lot of people talk to me about, is it even possible for people, who have an avoidant attachment, particularly a disorganized attachment, to heal? Because I think, obviously, when I talk about a lot of the severe cases of attachment styles, it can be very easy, I think, to have doom and gloom over the subject, like, oh God, is it a lost cause? Are people who have like this, anything but an anxious attachment style just lost in the wind and they're never going to heal? And I'm like, no, it's very possible to heal, but it is one of those things where it's down to each and every individual person. So I was going to start off with by saying, would you like to share a bit about your experience of what disorganized attachment means for you, and also a bit about that healing journey and how it's been for you?
Yeah. So disorganized attachment for me, it's a blended attachment style. It's fearful avoidance. So there's that anxious side to the attachment, and then there's the avoidance side to the attachment. And when I first got into dating, I was in a fairly secure relationship, but I think I was quite dissociated. And I was pretty avoidant in that relationship, but not really knowing anything about attachment at that time. Partner at the time, and we were together for about 8 years, he was quite anxious. But we seemed to make it work. But it wasn't until I started dating somebody who was avoidant after that relationship where I started to realize, holy shit, my nervous system started to get really dysregulated. I met a ton of anxiety. And then I started to do some research around attachment, and I read the book Attached, realizing that I actually thought at that time I had an anxious attachment style because I had never experienced any avoidance. That relationship took it out of me, and I went on a long, deep healing journey for my attachment style from that point forward, and that was about 10 years ago. The guy after that I dated was anxious. And that brought out my avoidance side in a big way. And I was like, wait a minute, I went from completely dysregulated to now completely avoidant. And when I say dysregulated, I mean more like on the anxious spectrum, because avoidance is a form of dysregulation in its own right.
Yeah.
And then I started to question, I'm like, okay, this is really interesting. Why is this changed? And I started to do some more research, and I started to realize that perhaps I had this disorganized attachment style. And healing. I've been through some things in my life. I've been through, the breaking up of my family when I was younger. I had a crack addiction from the age of 17 to 24. Different things like this, and healing this stuff. I chum it up as codependency. Essentially, it's all under that umbrella of developmental type trauma, and it's been the hardest transformation for me that I've had to make. I started the transformation 10 years ago, and I would say I'm just now coming into a lot of security. I would say I'm predominantly secure now. And but it's really interesting because who I'm with will have a strong influence on my attachment. So if I were to date a guy who's strongly avoidant, anxiety comes out in me, even though I've established a lot of security in my attachment. But I want to just say too, because you know, we I think a lot of people put security on a pedestal, and secure people aren't perfect. They have anxiety still too. If they're dating somebody who's highly avoidant, they can still become very anxious as well. I think the difference is that a lot of people who are secure, they don't make it mean anything about them, right? They're not like, oh, I'm not good enough, or whatever it might be. And that's kind of where I'm at now, right? So yeah, I think it's been a tough road. If I date somebody who's anxious, I tend to get a little bit kind of protective of my time and my space and my energy. But now I'm able to really communicate and say, like, you know, set boundaries and speak up for myself and make positive need requests and these sorts of things. So and now I'm dating somebody with a secure attachment, and I'm feeling extremely regulated and happy, and we have this really beautiful balance of space and closeness, and so yeah, feels pretty good. Yeah.
Big congratulations to you too, because I think a lot of people can relate to that story, not just those who have a disorganized attachment, but I think anyone with an insecure attachment, because I think it is one of those things where, you know, as you touched on, different people, the way they relate, their nervous system can have such a profound impact on how we show up in relationships and dating.
Yeah.
And I have to say, as a lot of my audience would agree with, being with someone who's like mega avoidant can bring out some very, you know, very protective parts in us, some very, you know, some parts of us that just do not want to be abandoned, obviously, but there's so much other stuff that goes into that as well, that I think it's quite common for a lot of people to be like, what the hell just happened there? And start going down the rabbit hole of attachment theory, being like, what is this? How did I get myself involved in this? And I have to say, I think it would be hard too to recognize, particularly after you've healed from like that more anxious attached side, to then get to another side of it being like, oh God, I also have this other avoidant part of me as well too, that's quite dominant in different relationships as well. You know, obviously in attachment theory, we say things like, oh, okay, well, you know, your attachment style, it shifts depending on who you're with. To that, I partially agree.
Yeah.
But I think that if you look over the history of someone's relationships, you can quickly see that there's a dominant style that seems to manifest in and across a lot of interpersonal relationships. What are your thoughts with that?
Yeah, I agree with you, but what I would probably say is who we date will stimulate the fear, and I think the fear can kind of shift a little bit. So when I look at anxious people, they tend to have like a conscious fear of abandonment, but an unconscious fear of intimacy. And I think avoidance are going to be the opposite. I think disorganized, because that's what we're talking about today, I actually think in myself, I have a conscious fear of both. And so I'm constantly dancing and relating between not wanting to be abandoned and not wanting to be smothered. So for me, who I'm dating depends on the fear that I'm relating with. And so a lot of my healing has come through being able to understand my fear, my core wounds that are being activated by the fear, and then being able to start doing the things that secure people do, which is communicate your fears, be vulnerable, make positive need requests, and start to advocate for yourself in the relationship, so the fears can therefore then be seen, recognized, tended to, and revealed at the end of the day. I think reveal and learning the art of revealing ourselves in a vulnerable way is really a big piece of healing attachment wounding, because many of us with insecure attachment, doesn't matter the flavor of your insecure attachment, there's so many unmet needs that we probably experienced in childhood that we've developed all these protector parts to try and like negotiate with our environment on, you know, not having these needs met, right? So a good example is like if we weren't emotionally attuned to or validated emotionally as a child, we might have learned to just shut off our emotions and not feel them, and we dissociate, right? So coming out of the closet as an emotional being, once we start accessing more security, means emotional revealing what we're feeling emotionally and being able to communicate that. But it's an interesting dance, because a lot of people in this world can't hold that. So no wonder a lot of people are terrified to do that, because most people are not good at holding other people in their emotions. They personalize them, they take even offense or these things to people's displays of emotion. They get uncomfortable and insecure about it. So, and then it perpetuates the developmental attachment trauma, right? So you got to, I think a skill that secure people have too is probably discernment. It's not like blah, here's my emotions, or like I'm never going to show you my emotions ever, right? It's like this in between. It's like, okay, I'm going to feel you out a little bit and see, like, does this person have the capacity to hold me? If they do, I'm going to proceed further. So I noticed what I do now is I kind of like test people, but in a healthy way. It's like, maybe I'll share a little bit and see how they receive that. If they receive it well, I'll go to the next step. Right, as opposed to before, I used to bluff on people, and then I'd be like, they can't hold my emotions. Well, it's really tough when somebody blahs on you to be able to hold that, right? So
I completely agree.
yeah.
You know what, though? I have a lot to say to that. Like, in regards to the emotional vomiting that can happen, I mean, I'm guilty of doing that too. I can also see why that would also create a lot of intensity in those early interactions of getting to know someone as well too. And I think a lot of people, myself included, when I've dated a lot of fearful avoidant attachers, I have to say those early days, months of chemistry making can be bloody intense, because I think there is so much vulnerability that gets thrown at people too.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's a bad thing in and of itself. Obviously, there's a desire for connection. And I also think certainty. I think a lot of fearful avoidant attachers are looking for certainty that they're making the right choice with a partner.
Yeah.
And as easy it is for me to say, well, we're never going to be 100% certain that we're with the right person, I think because there is a lot of that conscious fear, as you said, of abandonment, they're very preoccupied with like, right, I need to make sure that I'm getting the right response. I'm choosing the right person. This is going to work well for me. And I think that can also lead to some complications because of how quickly things escalate. And then, of course, that avoidance side comes out as just like, whoa, I need space. I'm not ready for this. I don't like this. So I think it's really interesting how that desire for connection can then trip up the other side for the fearful avoidant very quickly if they're not aware of it. Circling back to some of the fears that you were bringing up, I find that across a lot of my content every now and then, and I mean a lot of other content creators that talk about attachment, people understandably, when they're hurt by, off the back of these experiences, will say things like, well, if they wanted to, they would, or they're just not that into you. Or they'll say, well, everybody has a choice. Like, avoidance can, and people who are anxiously attached can make a choice to, change their behavior in the heat of the moment. We all get triggered. It's not just an excuse to destroy others.
Yeah.
And my argument back to that is to say, well, actually, I don't think anyone with an insecure attachment is intentionally going out there to hurt others.
Yeah.
But I don't think people have a very good understanding of trauma. Like you said beautifully about how, a lot of us are raised without emotional attunement, without understanding our emotional world as well too.
Yeah.
I think there's also a lack of education about when someone gets into a fight, flight, freeze and fawn response, people with an insecure attachment are going to behave irrationally, and it's not done, with this purpose of just destroying others.
Exactly. Yeah, bang on. And that, again, I think a sign that you're moving more towards security is that you're not personalizing other people's behaviors, because insecure people are in protective mode. They're in their trauma responses. So it doesn't mean anything about you. It's not that you're not good enough or these sorts of things. I'm going to be betrayed. Like all the core wounds that we tend to carry as insecure attachers, those get activated, and then we make other people's behaviors mean something about us. Security is about this person is behaving in a way that is conducive to their wounding, right? So if we can learn to not personalize it, that's a great sign that you're moving more towards security. Yeah. I think a lot of FAs, like fearful avoidance, I think they carry a lot of wounding around being betrayed. I think is a big one. I'm not safe, I will be betrayed. But I think a huge one is people won't be there for me. A lot of people with FA attachment, it's this hot, cold, and wanting intimacy, desperately wanting intimacy and being so good at being vulnerable and connection. But then when it comes close, it gets scary, and it's like, this person can't hold me. I see a lot of that in my practice with people with FA, so they bounce. they're like, I'm out of here, right? So that's when the avoidance side comes on, because there's this core belief of people won't be there for me when I really need them, because likely their attachment was developed because a parent was very hot and cold with them, was only there for them maybe when they were, you know, caretaking for them or doing something. So love didn't come free. It always came at a cost, right? This is just some flavors that I see a lot with FA attachers. Yeah.
I've seen a lot of that too. And I think there's also a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that occurs for a lot of FAs with these fears too, in that there's, as you said, the betrayal wound, the fears of like, oh, this person's not going to meet my needs. The dangerous thing is that I find that a lot of FAs start to, you know, due to their trauma, start to behave in ways that can be erratic, that can be quite hot and cold and very jarring. And a lot of the time, you know, this behavior on one hand might be to test their partner, but at times it can also be the catalyst that causes their partner to be like, I just can't do this anymore because, you know, no matter how much I love you, no matter how much you've said to me, you know, don't leave me, and I always push people away, you know, it gets to a point where I think a lot of partners reach burnout and they're just like, this is the hardest thing for me to do, but at the same time, I've got to save myself. And it's devastating, I think, for both people for different reasons. You know, for the partner, obviously, there's a lot of love there, and often they're going through a lot of grief and with all like symptoms off the back of it. And for the FA, I think it almost becomes another confirmation that people just leave me and that, you know, I can't be with anyone. So it's pretty heartbreaking for both people.
Yeah, it's tough. It's I've got a trail of relationships that I'm just like, oh my gosh. I showed up in such toxic ways in those relationships, that the people that I was attracting showed up in toxic ways, and it was very painful. But I'm just a firm believer too that relationships don't happen in our lives for no reason. They come in and they teach us things. So every single relationship I had, even though there was toxicity in them, they showed me a part of myself that needed healing. And then if you're you know, conscious enough to go and do that work, you know, these relationships are really, they're compasses, and they're pointing us in the direction of how to liberate ourselves. And you know, I'm now, like, I would say, yeah, probably like 90% secure. And I'm also realizing that my attachment style that was developed as a child is like, I have so many gifts from being disorganized. From, you know, disorganized people are extremely attuned to their partners. They're really good at vulnerability. They're very present. They're good communicators, you know, and some of those gifts get trumped by things like suspiciousness in relationships and not being able to trust easily and those sorts of things. But it doesn't negate the gifts that we have in being insecure. And you know, now that I've earned my badge of security, like, I have all of that depth and wisdom from being insecure for most of my life, that it makes me an amazing practitioner. It makes me an amazing partner, because I know what it feels like to have insecurity. And even dating secure people does not mean there's not going to be insecurities and fears and needs that you need to have, right? So I just think that now I'm very attuned to myself, my partner, and these sorts of things. I think is really important. Yeah.
I would agree. I think that a lot of fearful avoidant attachers, especially the ones I worked with, can be bloody good at attuning themselves to what their partner's going through, and I think actually have the capacity for great empathy. I mean, it's interesting because when we look at the flavor of avoidant attachment, whether it be fearful or dismissive, it's interesting because the dismissives, I think, can be very emotionally unattuned in quite significant ways, where like, with all due respect, you know, a lot of them can have low-grade depression. Like, that's quite obvious because of how disconnected they are. And I think it's a shame for them because they're really missing out on a very vital set of information in terms of their emotions. Whereas I think with fearful avoidant attachers, it's almost like they've gone to the other extreme, where it's almost like too much information at times because of hypervigilance. And I think that people can have a lot of misunderstanding for how distinctive these styles can actually be in terms of how they relate, how they show up. And I think it's, you know, I think it's wonderful when we hear people like yourself who have, you know, tremendous self-awareness and also self-accountability too. I often find a lot of fearful avoidants are actually very diligent in wanting to work on themselves, because they're like, yeah, I can see my problems, you know, for days, and I need to work on it too. One thing you touched on too was about how you can look back at some of the behaviors that, you made out of a place of trauma or out of a place of fear, and how it was a bit of a, hindsight of like, oh God, I didn't like the way that I behaved in that way. For many avoidant attachers, I know that they can also have a core wound of like, I am a bad person or I am defective. To me, like hearing you reflect on that very casually suggests to me that, I know it wouldn't have been easy, but it does suggest to me that there has been a level of like, being able to take time to process and integrate that rather than personalize that. Because I know for a lot of avoidant attachers, that can be brutal in holding on to a lot of guilt over many things in their lives, whether they truly believe that they were accountable for it or not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think shame. I really do think shame is the underpinning of most attachment, fear and shame.
Yeah.
And those two are like brother and sister. And I think that's how I kind of indirectly got into working with attachment, because I work with shame. And with shame is so much avoidance. And, I see a lot of shame in FA and DA, right? Attachers. Not as much with AP. AP is more on the fear spectrum, I think, whereas the shame is in the other two. And I wanted to there was a couple people saying like my ex, like in the comments, there's people saying like my ex was FA, but he might have been DA because he didn't communicate very well. And I think that's, there's definitely crossover in all this, and all of these attachment styles. It's not like I'm one and I hold on to that one. I think we can move between them. And I would say for me, I'm like FA leaning anxious, and then there's FA leaning avoidant. And if people that are maybe FA leaning avoidant, their tendency would be to move towards moving away, not communicating. So I'm not saying that all FAs are going to be like really strong communicators. I think it depends on where you're leaning. And I think, FAs, you have kind of, you're going to have a camp of FAs that they bounce when things get hard, and you're going to have a camp of FAs that want to have more closeness. Which is why it's disorganized, because you're essentially moving between anxious and avoidant within the attachment. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that people often, I think, mistake this as being, a lot of different things. But the reality is it's very much its own subgroup, and there's a lot of intersectionality that goes on with it too. I know books like Attached, I can't remember the specific like number or the percentage, say like the disorganized attachment population or percentage is something like 5%. But I've got to be honest, I think to me, based on my experience, it's way higher than that. And, especially when we, something that neither of us have talked about before, but I was chatting with some colleagues about the influence of culture upon attachment formation in kids growing up. And some colleagues of mine were chatting about how, particularly in places like, for example, the UK, there's a real attitude and rhetoric of keep calm and, move on without actually taking account for emotions. And I think we see a lot of people where there's a lot of dismissive avoidancy in the men and APs in the women, as an example. And other cultures, like depending on like the value systems, it can also result in higher percentages of one attachment group over another. And I think that what's interesting in Western countries like Australia, America, Canada is there's almost like, I think, greater populations of FAs that are showing up because on one hand, we're not completely denigrating emotions, but at the same time, there's still a real lack of emotional attunement.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, if you look at like gender constructs, I think for sure, I would fully agree with you, that a lot of men exhibit these avoidant tendencies because if you think about the way people show up, like usually in anxiety, it's emotional dysregulation, right? It's under-regulation of emotion. So it's like displays of emotion is usually what comes up in protest behaviors, and there's an aspect of vulnerability when you are anxious and you're having to come forward or you're having to act out and stuff. There's a feeling of being out of control, which is very vulnerable. Whereas DAs tend to be more composed, and like their presentation at least is very composed and like, I'm not going to have emotions, and very stoic. But behind the scenes, there's likely a lot of anxiety happening within, right? So it's kind of like, I think I said on the podcast that you and I did, anxious people tend to be anxious with others and avoidant of self, right? A lot of self-abandoning happening.
Yeah.
Whereas DAs tend to be anxious with self and avoidant with other, right? So it's really fascinating how that plays itself out.
I
Yeah.
would agree. And do you think in between those, where anxious, as you said, is avoidant of self and anxious of others, and the reverse is for DAs, do you think FAs sort of flip between the two circumstantially?
Yeah. Yeah, it depends. Again, with FAs, it's always about who are they dating? Who are they dating? Like if you look at APs, they're always going to attract avoidance on the healing journey. That's just what they need, right? And AP is not going to attract another AP because the system won't get activated enough for them to confuse their attachment injuries with love or lust or whatever it might be. So I rarely see people being like, oh, I'm attracting another anxious partner, or avoidance tend to not attract each other, right? Whereas FAs, they can bounce between the two. So depending where we're at on the healing journey, I find like for me to heal my anxiety of the anxious part of my attachment, I had to go through avoidance. It was a very, very important part. So I actually think I went avoidant into anxious, back into avoidance. And then I was kind of a little ping-ponging back and forth between anxious and avoidance, but not like big. And then I started to meet more security. So it was a lot of ping-ponging back and forth, and it was very confusing. But what happened with that is I was attracting partners who exhibited different aspects of insecure attachment, essentially. So I think it was anxious, avoidant, anxious, avoidant, right? It was ping-ponging. So they brought out different parts of my attachment. And I'm like, now I can look back and be like, thank you to each one of them. It was so painful going through it, but thank you, because without you, basically stimulating all my wounds and my triggers, like they wouldn't have come to the surface to be healed. So I have to have gratitude for that process, even though it was brutal and I would hate to have to go through it again. But yeah.
I completely agree with everything you said. Like, I mean, as someone who leans hard on the AP stuff, mildly hard on the AP side of things,
Yeah.
I mean, when I think of what you're describing with looking back on previous exes and partners, I've got to say, I'm so grateful for every one of them. Like, I mean, majority of them have definitely leaned FADA. And, I have to say a lot of, what I call detached love for them. I wish them all the best in their journey. But man, did they teach me so much about myself and stuff that I needed to, take time to work through as well. And I will admit, look, being on the receiving end of any of these attachment styles, depending on like the context of each of these relationships, can be gnarly. Like it can be really heartbreaking, traumatic, painful, and at worst abusive. And I think that, I know a lot of my audience is still in a healing phase, being off the back of a very severely avoidant experience too. Yeah. But I think there is a real beauty to when you kind of get to a stage where you can look back and go, that was actually necessary. Like I needed, like even though I would never wish that on my worst enemies, I needed that in order to better understand myself. And I think it's very easy for a lot of people to almost skip this experience by demonizing their partner, regardless of the attachment style, being like, I hate all APs, they're all needy and break boundaries. DAs are the worst, they just leave you when things are getting good, etc. But I think that, if you do that, you're also losing the greatest sense of agency, which is how did I get here and what do I need to do differently? I don't think anyone consciously looks for these experiences, but I think unconsciously, a lot of that hidden emotional directiveness plays such a huge part in what goes on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, again, for me, it's just a big sign of healing when it's like, okay, what's going on for me? What's going on for me? Like even in this new partnership that I'm building and forming, like there's little fears coming up, and the old Matt would have gone looking for what's going on in that person's world and left myself to go examine like what's and displacing or not taking responsibility. Now it's like, okay, I'm going to sit with myself. I'm going to be with this young part that's been activated, because that's what it is. I still have my higher self. He's completely here. He's activated. Let's go and tend to this young part that's hurting, feeling scared. And for FAs, it's always fear. Like I have a lot of fear when I'm starting to get to know somebody that they're going to leave or these sorts of things. But what I'm really good at now is revealing that and sharing that. So I've been letting this guy know that this is what's coming up for me. I'm having these feelings, and this is what it's attached to. My father left the household when I was little, and I'm having a somatic memory coming up around this, and I'm projecting it into the relationship. Can you help me? right? Like that is vulnerability. That is where you'll make progress in your relationship, is like reaching out, as opposed to, like I always say, like the mantra of a secure person is like, talk it out, don't act it out. Like insecure
Yeah.
attachers love to act out the shit, and because they don't want to be vulnerable, right? Whereas secure attachers, they talk it out. They'll say, I'm scared, I need reassurance. They'll make need requests. I just think that's what we need to be focusing on as insecure. If you have an insecure attachment, is learning how to communicate fear. It's essential. It's so essential. Yeah.
I completely agree with everything you said. And I think this nicely dovetails to the major thing, part of this conversation that I wanted to talk to you about, which is, so how does one heal from a disorganized attachment?
Yeah.
I know for me, linking to what you said as someone who leans more anxious, preoccupied, AP, that I had to go through the breakup recovery off the back of a very bad case of a situationship with a dismissive avoidant. And that was essential because I needed to just sort of go through that. And as you said, I know for me, I had to connect with myself and go, hang on a minute, how am I feeling right now? Like, let's stop analyzing this person. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what attachment style they had. I had to get to a point being like, did I like the way that this person left me? And that was the first, I suppose, pebble down the mountain of my healing, where I was like, no, actually, I didn't like the way that I was treated. Even though everything was phenomenal for the most part, the way they broke up with me was just enough for me to be like, if I was ever going to do that to someone, I wouldn't do it in that particular way. And that's when I started to, you know, go around and I was like, wait a minute, I've been letting myself put up with a lot of bad behavior for a very long time. And that's when I started to realize, frankly, how rock bottom my self-esteem was. And of course, a lot of that came from stuff that was outside of my control growing up. But it was up to me to be like, okay, we've got to course correct hardcore right now. And you know, it's very easy for those of us who are, I think, more securely attached to be like, boundaries this, you know, connect with your feelings that. But back in the day, oh my God, like it's bloody hard. So I'm going to take a breath and because I'm keen to hear your thoughts on what it's been like for you.
Oh gosh, yeah, I got so much that I can share on this. So okay, there's some main things. One of them is, if you are leaning anything in the realm of avoidance, you probably have a tendency to want to not feel your emotions, keep them at bay. So there might be some dissociation, numbing, escaping. You got to activate. You got to feel your emotion. You got to activate. So you got to start turning towards, I say. Most avoidance turn away. You got to start turning towards, and you're going to probably become under-regulated. You go from over-regulation of emotion to under-regulation of emotion, usually when you're starting learning to process emotion. So I would say that's like one of the most important things. And then moving towards like some form of inner child work, where I call it like consciously connecting with the victim. Most people with insecure attachment have a victim part of the inner child that is hurting. He or she is angry. And a lot of us learn to just buck up, like, you know, so we maybe bypass the victim stage, and so going back, connecting with the victim. So that might look like anger journaling, rage journaling. I know you talk a lot about that, these sorts of things. So and then there's trauma work that needs to be done. And I think that's really a bulk of this work. I've done T.S. Gibson's training on like subconscious reprogramming and this sort of stuff. Amazing work, but it has to be sectioned in at the right point in the healing journey. If you try to do subconscious belief reprogramming with somebody who has a lot of trauma that's not been processed, it's not going to work. And I see that with my clients, and it was a massive lesson I learned. I'm like, you can't do this work unless there's trauma work been done. So I do some somatic work, anger journaling, inner child work, giving the voice back to this wounded part of us. Then I see the subconscious belief reprogramming work as the building back up, right? So you got to kind of tear everything back down, and you got to heal and cry and grieve. Then you do the subconscious belief reprogramming to kind of have the remembrance of, I am worthy of love. You know, people aren't always going to betray me. I can trust again, right? Because the traumatized nervous system will never let you trust again if you don't do the work of releasing some of that stored emotion from the system. So Then there's so many modalities, honestly, that I've used. I would say plant medicine's been tremendous for me. Like I've used psilocybin and ayahuasca. I don't recommend just to run off and go do that. Like, you know, it's something that you'd want to like work towards, have an anchor point. But I know for me, plant medicine's been very helpful for trauma healing. So yeah, those would probably be the top ones. We could have a whole episode just on this, talking about different modalities alone. But you know, and finding a practitioner, whether it's a coach, a therapist, counselor, whatever, that is trauma trained, not just trauma informed. They have to be trauma trained, you know, attachment theory trained, and like I think probably IFS, like internal family systems work. Would be some of the modalities I would look for in a therapist if I was moving towards somebody that I wanted to do this work with. Yeah.
Completely agree with everything you said. I have so much to say to everything that you just mentioned. As you said, this could be like part 2 of an entire talk. I want to start by touching on something. I think you referred to Thais Gibson as someone who taught you about subconscious reprogramming.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm going to harp on this for a minute because I've seen a lot of her work and I love a lot of her work, but I think it's very easy. This isn't specifically about Thais, but I think it's very easy for people to jump and go for the jugular and be like, okay, what we just need to do is do bottom up and just focus exclusively on what's going on in the nervous system, and you'll be hunky-dory in the middle of the night within 3 months. And I'm like, hell fucking no. Like, the worst thing you can possibly do in many of these instances. And I have seen some people even try and do inner child exercises with people who are just simply not ready for that, and all their shame hits them like a truck. And so you're right. And the reason I'm taking my time with this is because, you know, it is actually about that, is the fact that I think many of us, particularly with insecure attachment, are just like, we come in with a lot of rush. We want to heal. We want to try and fix ourselves as quickly as possible. But part of healing, regrettably, is actually slowing everything down, because our nervous system, even though we are in a state of dysregulation, we're like, right, how do I fix this? How do I get on with this? I love that attitude for a lot of you, but the reality is that your nervous system does not like that. In fact, there's greater chances of whiplash and also bouncing from therapy and also just leaving before you even really get to the work because of how intense it is. I've actually said to a few clients who come in with that intensity, I've been like, hey, I'm feeling a rush and, you know, I love that, but can we also just slow everything down a bit? Because I think it's very easy for people to get in their own way when they come in with that level of intensity too. And it's also part of the healing work too, is, you know, I think I've seen this across a lot of social media where people will bitch about CBT, and even though I have my gripes about CBT every now and then, and talk about, you know, how talk therapy is not useful. I'm like, you do realize it's those building blocks that allow you to then get to the next stage of things. So this goes to your point, which is you can't bypass the steps of this journey. And at a macro level, you know, I'm not sure how familiar you are with tarot, but I often tell people you're going through a tower moment. You know, you are literally shedding layers upon layers of stuff. And you know, you're also going to be learning, you know, it's easy for people to be like, oh, well, you need to learn how to act secure, have boundaries. That's lovely. But the reality is that just acting in a secure way does not mean you are internally secure inside of yourself as well, too. So there's so many pieces to this. You know, there's the slowing it down, working on your internal stuff, taking steps that actually align with who you are. Frankly, it's a whole existential crisis and a half, because it's not just the attachment style that gets worked on, it's so many dimensions of life as well too.
Great. Well said. And I want to say this too, because I think talk therapy is so important in this process, and a lot of people are like, we have to move towards somatics and we have to do this. I think that's good for maybe, like, we'll call it like, I guess, just general trauma, like PTSD, those sorts of things, where we need to move towards somatics. But developmental trauma is very different than that. It comes on in layers, it happens in relationships, and it's the wound of disconnection. So what do we need to heal that? We need connection. So the foundation of all healing, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's somatic or psychological, it's presence. We need presence. And I think in a therapeutic relationship, and this is the gifts that I offer, I don't do a ton of somatic work with clients. I offer emotional attunement emotional validation, presence, and heart-centeredness. And most people are so appreciative of this, and that's the part that of their journey that I'm important in, is showing them what a healthy relationship looks like. What does it feel like to be attuned to? What does it feel like to be listened to? What does it feel like for somebody to take an interest in your inner world, right? These are things that insecure attachers didn't get. So it's really important, the talk therapy model, to like model what it is like to have secure attachment. Really, at the end of the day, I think it's so important. Yeah. I love talking about this stuff.
I do. In fact, I was thinking to myself, I'm really enjoying this today, having a chat about this.
Yeah.
I get very passionate about this too because, you know, I think that it's very easy to diss on the talk therapy side of things, but you're exactly right, because we're actually creating a secure relationship with the client. And it's about, you know, reparenting, teaching them how to reparent themselves as well too. And it can be hard at times. Like, I've had some clients who understandably come to me in a place of desperation, being like, I don't know how to parent myself. Like, what does that even mean? What does that even look like? And I'm like, I have to be honest, I'm like, yeah, actually, it's hard to verbalize and even properly articulate what that looks like, because, you know, there's so many components of reparenting oneself as well too. Like, you know, yes, there's the relationship between the clinician and the client, but then outside of the therapist's office, there's also so many other aspects of it too, because attachment, lest we forget, is not just a romantic relationship issue. It's also something that affects so many other areas of life too. Like, I occasionally will talk about how, you know, it's easy for insecure attachers to have a terrible relationship with food, money, work. And a lot of those areas, I've got to be honest, need to be cleaned up. And that ain't my responsibility in terms of like what goes on in the therapy office as well too. Like, I've actually said to a few clients recently, I'm like, listen, you know, I understand that you actually have very wholesome, for instance, values around money. You don't want too much. You don't want to be someone who's bragging about wealth, and you have issues with capitalism and the patriarchy. Valid. But you also need to take care of this, because part of our work, I think, in working on ourselves and becoming secure in ourselves is actually working on having secure attachment to these other areas of our lives as well too. And if we're letting ourselves down, that can be an act of re-traumatization.
Yeah, I agree. I think in Tias's trainings that I took, she talks about like subconscious, like comfort, creature comforts. I think that's the right word for it. And like what we move towards is really showing us like what we desire. Like, for example, within my insecure attachment, I had a lot of wounding around like groups and not wanting to be around people. And one of my favorite shows is Big Bang Theory. And it's like, you know, there's like 7 people that hang out all the time and they have a lot of closeness, and I don't have that in my life. So it's like we're finding ways to get our needs met subconsciously. You know, she calls it like drops in the bucket. So at least the bucket's getting something. But when we learn to move towards our needs and learn how to act on getting our needs met, we kind of turn the taps on. I like that analogy. So it sounds like that's the same thing. Like the relationships we have to food and money and these sorts of things really, really do highlight maybe unmet needs that are happening for us if we're overeating a lot. Like maybe there's some sort of unmet need that needs to be tended to, and if we can move towards getting curious about our emotions and what's happening in our emotional world, it can be a game changer.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that it's and this is a concept that I've been talking about a lot with some of my clients, is that it's very hard to do that when we have what I call an unconscious addiction to unhappiness, meaning that, you know, even though consciously we know that love is acceptance, respect, warmth, kindness, we know that we should have a great relationship with food, money, we should enjoy our work. The problem is that a lot of that unconscious stuff gets in the way of that too, in that, you know, we can associate emotionally work with stress. I need to work hard in order to finally be respected and to have a form of validation. And it's like, well, actually, no, you don't. Like, sure, a degree of hard work is important, but you don't need to, you know, slave away for something just to prove yourself. Like, that's an example where, you know, that addiction to pain, to stress, and thinking that you're going to have some reward at the end of all of this might actually be leading you to, unfortunately, self-sabotage your life. And so I think it's really important for people to sometimes reflect and question how is, that addiction to unhappiness sometimes playing out. And it, frankly, for people with insecure attachment, it can be very prevalent in so many domains of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I do a lot of work, like I said, with shame, and one of the things that I teach people is that you have to deactivate the protector parts that are preventing you from feeling the shame or the inadequacy. Perfect example is like overachieving or perfectionism and these sorts of things. If you're continuously engaging in those things, you're not actually healing. So I just think it's really crucial for any of this work that we have to deactivate these things that we're doing that are protecting us from feeling the things that we need to heal. If we're not feeling it, we're not healing it. It's classic in psychology. So it's important to go towards things that are coming up for us as opposed to constantly trying to escape them. I think that's a really important. So, and like you're saying, slow down. Most people that I see with insecure attachment or unresolved trauma, it's busyness. Our culture really actually values busyness and rewards busyness. And I think a lot of people are stuck, and it leads to burnout, right? And when people get burnt out, they have nervous breakdowns. That's the system saying, okay, it's time for you to face your trauma. And nervous breakdowns, I think that's what they are. Or depression, where it becomes debilitating. You can't get out of bed. Like, your system is saying it's time to start doing this work that you haven't been willing to do because you've been too busy, right? So like you said, presence, slowing down, like, I can't emphasize that enough. My trauma healing journey started when I started slowing down. Before that, I thought I was working on it, but you can't do your way through trauma. Trauma is not a doing thing, it's a beingness thing. You have to be with yourself. And I think that would be kind of something that I would love to leave the audience with, is like, find time every day, no matter how busy you are. We all got the same amount of hours in the day. Find time to slow down. And for me, I'll go out for a walk. No electronics, nothing, and I'm just with nature, and I'm focusing on my feet on the ground, walking. I'm focusing on the scents that I'm smelling, and I'm trying to stay out of my mind as much as possible, and that, it really helps me kind of stay grounded every day. And different people have different things: yoga, meditation, it could be, gardening, different things. I think those things are really undervalued in the therapeutic world, like, of just the day-to-day things we can do to slow down. I think it's really, really important.
I completely agree. I completely agree. It's an expensive hobby of mine, but I like scuba diving. But the thing is that to anyone who dives, you take that damn slow, because it's an actual risk to go fast with that as a sport. And for me, I know it's water-based activities. Like, I love surfing. That's a bit on the quick side, but diving for me is, it's all about being present and also being very aware of your feelings when you're there too, because it's very easy to be uncomfortable. You can have like fin blisters, you can have oxygen issues, you can be having issues with your mask, and that actually makes you pay attention to your body and how you're feeling and be like, whoa, what do I need to enjoy this moment and be present with everything that's going on? And when you literally have no choice but to breathe slowly and intentionally, it's 40 minutes of intense breath work, expensive breath work, but it's very pretty and very good for you. And I think, I'm not encouraging everyone out there to go scuba diving. Wonderful if you want to. But the thing is that Matt's absolutely right, is that, that intentional slowing down and finding time for you and to connect with things around you is a sign that you are actually heading in the right direction. And something else that I wanted to touch on, that I think I'm pretty confident you and I would be on the same page with this, is, in a lot of spiritual spaces, they talk about the art of surrender. And it's a very hard concept to get your head around when you're going through a healing journey, because I think a lot of people with insecure attachment need control. Even if they're not consciously looking for it, whether you are an anxious attacher and you like your more overt forms of control, or you're an avoidant and like your more covert forms of control. One of the key things in part of our healing journey is to let go, and that's bloody hard for many of us that thrive on certainty and need to feel constantly certain all the time. But I know for me, and this has really helped me in my healing journey, is just being like, take the timeline out of when you want to achieve things. And I know that's bloody hard, particularly for women who want to have certain milestones, particularly around having children. I get that. I'm not here to take that away from anyone. But generally speaking, I think part of attachment recovery is also being like, look, if you beholden yourself to a timeline, by 30, I'm going to have a house. By 35, family.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I like a goal. But a lot of those goals are often coming from, let's just say, not the most authentic places for everyone. Some of them they are, and I accept that. That's great. But I think that a lot of us need to learn how to just like let things just play out the way that they are, because that often leads to better understanding, growth, and actually leads you to where you actually could be going in a more authentic direction.
Yeah, I noticed the comment section lit up when you brought the word control into this. I just think it's so funny. Like human beings, yeah, it's tough. It's tough. We live in a world where there can be things around every corner that are scary, and there could be somebody that could hurt us, or like there's just it's inevitable. And I think again, that's a sign of spiritual maturity on the path, is when you are controlling less. But I do think control serves its purpose, and I think there's, maturity is really looking at discernment, where to have control, where to let go, where to give up control, and developing a relationship with the ego is so important, and developing a relationship with the inner child, because the inner child is the part of us that tells us it's not okay to let go of control, because I will be X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank. I'll be hurt. I'll be, mom and dad will whatever. Like if you grew up with an alcoholic parent, like all these things, like, and I see that so much with FAs, because FAs are characterized by tons of trauma. That's the most traumatized attachment style, in my opinion. And there's always an underpinning of chaos in the home, right? So what do we have to do when there's chaos in the home? Well, we learn to control in some way, right? Whether it's meeting other people's needs, turning off our own needs, which takes control. We have to control our own emotions and keep them at bay. So there's this notion of gripping, and I think that somatic work can really help with that. Yeah, I want to create some content. I'm not in a creative space right now. I'm taking some time off. I've got 5 weeks off, and then I'll come back in the fall. And I have on my list of a zillion things to do, to create a guided meditation on letting go of control, because I just see this so much with my clientele and my following, that there's just a lot of that. So I think it's important. I think this is an area I'm going to pat myself on the back right now, because I've really, really worked hard in this space, and I finally am in this place where I'm flowing more. And I think I've really integrated and embodied my divine feminine. The divine feminine is the flow, and the divine masculine is the force. And I think the force is the control. And a lot of us are in our masculine because it's not safe to be in our feminine in this crazy world that we live in. And but that's where it takes a lot of courage to be in our feminine. And I think I'm at that place. So I think I'm ready to offer that divine feminine medicine to the world when I'm done. And some people don't like those terminologies, so you call it the divine yin and yang. Like it's not about gender at all. It's the feminine is the more slow down beingness, and the masculine is more of the force and the doingness. So yeah.
I completely agree. And look, both of us as being part of the LGBT community, I understand that those terminologies can cause some conniptions for people, but I'm just like, no, it's just about energy and how you navigate things too. I mean, you could look at it almost a bit like, the relationship between the rational and the irrational. How do you navigate the emotional and the cognitive parts of ourselves as well too? Yeah. And that's a relationship that I think does require a lot of balance. I think, look, if I'm being twee and quaint, I think all of us are looking for peace, harmony, and balance in our lives. And healing is an act of balance. Like, we've talked about today about, control, perfectionism, fear. And even though some of these things might be barriers to our healing, lest we forget, we still need a little bit of those in our lives every now and then. Yeah. And I think part of healing is also coming to, as you said, greater discernment of the grey in a lot of this experience. I think people with insecure attachment tend to see things in black and white. Like, it's all or nothing. It's doom and gloom. I know for me, one of my biggest things as an ex-attacher has been, seeing the worst case scenario, being like, oh my God, what will happen? And now I'm like, oh, well, if it happens, I'll deal with it and I'll manage. Sure, it will feel uncomfortable, but I'm pretty confident I can manage it, unless it's death. That's a different circumstance altogether. But, I think it's really good for people to, take the time to integrate and also to find balance with a lot of this stuff, because I think it's very easy for there to be very dominant parts of us that roam unchecked.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I'm just trying to think of like something tangible that I can offer the audience. And I think for me, when I feel out of control or I feel the need to control, I'll get curious. And for me, I've had a tendency in the past to shame myself for being controlling or for these things, and that just does nothing. And the last year I've learned compassion for myself, and compassion for me is about curiosity, getting curious about it. And with control, it's the top layer. The next layer is going to likely be fear. There's a fear of something happening. So just get curious and ask yourself, what am I afraid that's going to happen right now? And then you figure out what that is. And then it's like, okay, well, I can handle this. I can handle this. If this did happen, I'm strong, and you kind of just offer yourself compassion and it's okay to be scared. There's a lot of things to be scared of in this world. We live in a scary world, so it's okay to be scared. And oftentimes when there's control issues, I have to do it all on my own. I have to face my fear all on my own. And if we can invite other people in and learn to co-regulate that fear with someone else, that's when we can start to surrender and let go of control. So we can't do this on our own, folks. We really can't. And trauma says that to us, that we have to do it on our own, but we can't. We can't. And that's what I think we got to surrender to first and give up control to first, is that we need each other. We really do. Yeah.
I completely agree. I have a couple last things to round out today's talk. I think a lot of us, including APs, even though we dwell a little bit on the codependence spectrum, can have a proclivity for hyper-independence in their own lives as well too. Like, I think insecure attachers tend to believe, well, I can do this on my own. Part of the healing, I think I can see the frustration in a lot of my AP clients where they're like, when they're healing and they're starting to work through this, they're worried about, never having a romantic partner to help them. They're worried that they're not going to be with anyone because they've been alone for a lot of their journey up until this moment. And it's like, yes, but you will look, having a romantic partner, wonderful. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that, and you should have that. You're entitled to that. But a lot of that subconscious yearning for a romantic partner was built on, well, if I do all of this work, then eventually I will have a partner. It's like, actually, that's not the goal of healing. Like, sorry to be the bearer of bad news to people, but it's like, that is not what we're here to do.
Yeah.
It's actually to build a better connection with yourself and therefore others as well too.
Yeah.
And that, don't worry, like, that'll come. But, the frustration you're feeling is probably because, and this is something we've touched on way back when, is you're fundamentally lonely. Is that you're emotionally disconnected from yourself and others, and everything's a bit lopsided, so you're feeling burnt out as a consequence. That's probably what's going on there. But the last thing that I wanted to touch on, that I wanted to talk to you, because I feel like you've got a lot of insight and you've got a lot of self-reflection, and this is to all of the people out there who are dating or have dated someone with a disorganized attachment or even a dismissive avoidant attachment. Right. My question to that is, just as we're rounding out, is, what would you tell someone if they're engaging with a fearful avoidant, let's say, and they have hope that things can turn around and they want things to get better? What would you say are the signs that they can, think of going forward, being like, okay, this is something you can definitely try working with your partner on, or let's be realistic here, this is a case where this person unfortunately has a few more years ahead of them before they realize they need to work on themselves, and you're probably not going to get it with this person?
Yeah, that's a big question. But I think there's gifts that we can give FAs, and I think the first one is transparency. So the guy that I'm connecting with right now is extremely good at this. It's a skill that comes to him naturally. So he tells me what he's doing. He's like, yeah, this is my plan this weekend. These are the things I'm doing, and he checks in, and he's very transparent about his life. And that doesn't feel like there's secrets, because I think, again, FAs carry a lot of suspiciousness in their attachment style. They don't trust easily. So transparency is a great way to mitigate that. Consistency. So showing up, it's like, if we say we're going to have a call, you show up. I made the need request in the relationship early on that I need contact daily. And that's even if it's just a emoji of a smiley face. He's a therapist, and I know he has really big days, and for him to just reach out after a day and say, hey, thinking about you, but I'm going to unwind for the night, that's enough for me, right? But I want daily contact, so consistency is important. And I think reassurance, right, is extremely important to offer each other, and he needs it from me too, and he's secure, right? We reassure each other constantly that, you know, we're in this together, and that it's okay to be scared, and it's okay to bring things into the relationship, I think is really important. And then, you know, the FA, like, we need to be showing up as well. We need to be practicing giving up control and trusting, and you know, having more positive self-talk around, like, it's okay, I'm safe. You know, even if this doesn't work out, I'll be okay, right? Like, I think about how many guys I've dated and then it didn't work out. Like, I was always okay afterwards. Like, I was good. You know, even an 8-year relationship that I was in, yeah, it took me a bit of time to recover from that. But guess what? I grew back stronger. So it's kind of like we have to always be reminding ourselves that, you know, we can do this, and we're a lot stronger than we think, and that we know. Like, you know, I always hear people saying, like, I'm so insecure, I don't have good self-esteem, or I don't have this, or I don't have that. But most people, well, really all people, are rising to the occasion in the best way that we can. So we're always going to rise. It's just how we do as human beings, right?
Completely agree. And I guess that in and of itself answers the question of, well, if that's the standard of where we want to have things, I guess anything outside of that could be in the realm of, you know, perhaps this isn't a secure relationship. And if that's the case, the question then becomes, well, am I a participant in this getting my needs met, or am I in a insecurely attached trauma bond?
Yeah.
And, you know, that's, I think, up to context, individual discernment. It's, you know, up in the air for that. But anyways, I'm going to round out here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for showing up and being part of this conversation today, talking about healing disorganized attachment. For people who want to find you and even work with you, I actually was going to ask, do you take international clients, or are you exclusively Canada at the moment?
I do take international clients. I'm not actually taking on new clients right now for my one-on-one work, but I put people on a wait list. So if you want to reach out and get on my wait list, definitely I can put you on the wait list. And I do run workshops, so authentic relating and empowerment workshops for highly sensitive people and empaths. And then I also work with gay men. So I have 2 workshops that I run, retreats, plant medicine retreats. If you're a GBTQ man wanting to do ayahuasca retreats, I offer those, different things like that. So yeah, you can find me at Landsiedel.com. Everything's there. Yeah.
Amazing. Perfect. And I know you and I will connect again at some point to discuss.
I can't wait. Yeah, we already have a topic in mind for. So yeah, we'll be. I love creating with you. You're great at creating.
Thank you. And I always enjoy the conversations that we have together. Like, I mean, even today I was like, oh, I'm really enjoying this. Even at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm like, this has got me wide awake now. So,
yeah.
Very grateful.
I'm stimulated.
I was going to say, go back to your 5 weeks of taking time off. You sound like you deserve it. And yeah, I look forward to connecting with you again too. And to everyone who was part of this today, thank you very much for participating, for being part of this. And if anything, I hope that this provides people with a degree of hope that if you are someone with an insecure attachment, especially disorganized and dismissive avoidant, you can heal.
Yeah.
It takes time, but you can heal. And those of you receiving into this, just know there are some that will have the capacity at this point in time, and there are some that don't. Yes. But I'll leave it there.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.